This is the Bureau of Lost Culture, bringing you more stories from the other side, from the underground, from the counterculture. I'm Stephen Coates. In 1962, a young man was stepping gingerly down a staircase in an underground club in Liverpool, stepping into a wall of sound and excitement. He was there on assignment from Granada TV to make a film about the band. By that time, he'd already led a rather interesting life by many people's standards, serving his national service in Scotland, where he learnt Russian with 5,000 other young British people, and then spending time as a spy, eavesdropping on Soviet pilots from the British listening station in Berlin. But what he experienced that afternoon in Liverpool, in that basement club, had such a powerfully transformatory effect on him that he had to stop his minicar on the way back to Manchester to throw up in a ditch. The band he'd been filming was, of course, the Beatles, just before their meteoric rise to fame. They had a transformatory effect on many, many, many millions of other people too, of course. They are the band that, in a way, overshadow much of pop counterculture in the 60s. A band that went to immense global pop stardom and then deliberately stepped into the counterculture themselves. Many of the guests on this show have talked about the influence of the Beatles, both in terms of their music and in terms of their whole vibe, their whole world, and the transformatory effect that they had on London when they arrived there in the 60s. But that was the UK. Of course, they had a huge effect in America and around the world. And perhaps nowhere as strongly as the effect they had in the Eastern Bloc, and in particular in the Soviet Union. I know from my own experience talking to Russians who were alive in the 50s and 60s, the incredible, almost spiritual effect that the Beatles had on young people in those times. So I'm very pleased today to welcome that young man who stepped down that staircase, the Cavern Club in Liverpool in 1962. Of course, he's not a young man anymore, but his life since then has been an extraordinary one, which in some ways has always been influenced by that experience and also by his experiences as a spy. He's made many documentaries, he's received many awards. He is, of course, an OBE, and he made the film When the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome him to the Bureau of Lost Culture. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you, Stephen.
Now, Leslie, you are our third OBE.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, I tend to forget about that. It was a long time ago. A richly comic experience getting the OBE, but there you go.
Hey, listen, if it's good enough for John Lennon, it's good enough for you, right?
Say no more.
Right. Now, listen, Leslie, I've done an intro about you a little bit, but really, in a way, I think it would be much more interesting for people to hear from you. Who is Leslie Woodhead?
Well, it's to tell it quickly, I am now just about a freelance filmmaker, but the important thing for me was that I joined Granada Television as a graduate trainee in 1961, when the going was good and Granada TV in Manchester was, the most progressive force in television. So I got phenomenally lucky. They were interested in doing surprising material as well as crap material. So it was a great moment and enormous luck that I landed there when I did, and then moved into mainly factual television. So I did the usual, foot march through the foothills of local programs and little, bits and pieces. And then as I moved into the 60s, I was doing everything from politics to music to the arts to quite, politics, local and international.
Right, so you cut your teeth at Granada and you made a huge amount of work there with them World in Action series and all sorts of documentaries. And then in 1989, you became an independent filmmaker, and since then have made an astonishing selection of films. Most recently, Ella Fitzgerald, but you made The Hunt for Bin Laden, The Day That Changed the World, The Children of Beslan, award-winning documentary about the Beslan incidents, all sorts of films about Russia and Russia's nuclear warriors, etc. Your Dean Reed film, we should talk about that later. Also, I mean, things like Strike, about the, solidarity in Poland. And of course, the film that I've not seen actually, but I'd love to hear more about it, is Invasion, about the invasion of in the Prague Spring in 1968. So you've had a whole history of both working for Granada, as you said, but also as an independent filmmaker. And even before that started, you had this kind of Russian Cold War, Eastern Europe connection, did you not, from your time in national service? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I was a bizarre accident, but I was one of the last generation of young men to do compulsory national service. And that, by chance, took me to a training as a Russian linguist. At that point, Her Majesty's services were in need of an intelligence capability, basically to spy on the Cold War enemy. So about 5,000 young men were hauled off to a converted pig farm in Scotland, a secret base for learning Russian. And we crammed to A-level in about 6 or 7 months. And I completed all of that, which was, we were taught by emigre Russians, teachers, scholars, people who were drifting around Europe, having had to flee the evil empire. So that was entertaining. It was a first introduction, really, to the realities of the Cold War enemy. And I became kind of a bit addicted about that.
Well, I mean, just explain that to me. So you're a sort of ordinary lad, Yorkshire lad.
Yeah.
But, you get to 18, national service, which for anybody who doesn't know is the kind of compulsory time in the armed services or a similar thing after the war. You've been picked out as one of 5,000 young people who are spirited off to this remote pig farm in Scotland, where you are all taught Russian from scratch in a period of months with the intention of spying. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, it's split rather. The really smart young people who completed the course went to Cambridge with the idea that they would be actual interrogators of either, Russians who'd fled or been picked up somewhere or other. My Russian was never quite good enough for that. So I was on a subsidiary. I joined the vast majority of graduates of this pig farm setup. And I was put to work learning the kind of Russian that you would need to listen in on Russian broadcasts. And the particular broadcasts that I was being trained for was the air communications between Russian fighter jets going in and out of Berlin and HQ in wherever the hell they were, listening in on this. So we learned an extraordinarily limited set of, while we were still in Scotland, we'd gone quite a long way with Russian. I mean, I was reading, the great Russian classics and good knows what. But that narrowed down when I got the spying role into listening in on these broadcasts. So without any real understanding of where I was going or what it would mean, where are we now? Yes, at the end of 1961, I was hauled off to listen in on these Russian pilots. And that was from a base in West Berlin.
Right, so you were taken out to West Berlin after you'd sort of finished your, sort of compressed hothouse training in Russian. But were you, Were you also? I mean, you said then you described them as the enemy, and I'm sure you say that with kind of inverted commas, as it were, around it. But I mean, was part of your training also a sort of ideological propaganda thing as well, or was it just taken for granted that at that time everybody would agree that the Russians were the enemy?
Yeah, no propaganda or ideology or anything like that. They were just trying to force feed us enough language to do this foot soldier's job. I always thought of myself as a foot soldier in the Cold War, of just listening in on. And what we did, just to explain, I was dumped in this listening post in Berlin, and in a fairly secret building. I think it was probably everybody knew about it. And what we had to do was headphones on, tuned to a number of frequencies, and just write down everything that was said, which was shatteringly dull. I mean, these pilots were saying, my undercarriage is down in luck, my fuel lights are glowing, I'm on my final circuit. It was that kind of ungalvanizing material. And I did that for 7 or 8 months, actually, in this curious hangout in West Berlin. And you got to a point where you could actually identify the individual pilots as they came and went by the tone of their voice. But nothing, and the only time I remember anything happening of any interest, well, two things. First of all, we got an intercept in which it became plain that they were targeting our building. I mean, the coordinates of their artillery centered on RF Qatar, which is where I was. Nothing ever happened about that, but it was a bit of a troubling moment.
Mm.
And the other thing was that they were very interested in the minutiae of our training and so forth. I was unaware of how much of that was supposed to be secure, but it didn't seem worth. And all of this, of course, was done by writing on a pad. All of our intelligence was written down with carbon paper, if you can believe it. That was the sum total of our work. And at the time, I think we all felt, well, as I said, there was no ideological purpose at all. Frankly, few of us could work out what any purpose was to be served by writing down hundreds of pages of longhand transcripts of these exchanges.
I suppose the idea was that they might sort of inadvertently let something slip, some piece of information, some nugget of useful, intel as they call it now, which then might be useful in some way in the kind of progression of the West's victory in the Cold War.
I think that's certainly true, but when I did my film about how the Beatles, my book about how the Beatles rocked the Kremlin, I talked to a very knowing professor at the University of Nottingham who said, "You're right, you were on the hunt for that. But more importantly, they weren't really interested in the content of the messages that you were scribbling down endlessly. What that was about was understanding troop movements. In other words, as he put it, the Russian military is a very big animal. And when it moves in the forest, it makes a good deal of rustling. And so, in other words, we were trying to provide the West with early intelligence. The big fear every day of our lives in Berlin was that they were going to walk in over the border, which they could have done in a heartbeat, and occupy our bit, and then eventually West Berlin. And it's hard now to recollect what a moment by moment fear this was. It was not long after Hungary and all the horrors of that. It was very, very nail-biting time.
When you talk about Hungary, you mean the Red Army moving into Budapest?
Yeah, exactly. And there was a fear that something like that could very easily happen in West Germany. And so we were really very much in the front line. In fact, my listening post in Berlin was so close to the Eastern Zone that you could actually hear the Russian soldiers singing at night in their billets. I mean, it was that close. And one of the scariest parts of what I was supposed to be doing was to ascend a direction-finding tower on the very, very border of East Berlin and of the Soviet friends, as we call them now. And the job was to, with a very rickety piece of apparatus, to try and locate where the signals were coming from on the other side, which was like a wheel that you pressed down and spun around. And when the signal dipped, that was where it was coming from. The bad news was it didn't work, this stuff. It really didn't. It was hopelessly fallible and basically a useless toy. So I and many of my colleagues used to fill our times with the Russian stuff chattering away in the background, and I used to listen to the Voice of America Jazz Hour.
Right, Willis Conover.
Yeah, Willis Conover. This is the majestic Willis Conover, and I grew up with Willis Conover in my ear rather than the Soviet pilots.
You know, that's interesting because I mean, I made a program here about the kind of, as I call it, the invisible battle of the Cold War airwaves, and you know, you were actually in Berlin, of course, and you know, and you know, the West broadcasting deep into the heart, or as deep into the heart of the Soviet Empire as they could, and Willis Conover, of course, was one of the soft power strategies, wasn't it, to target you know, Soviet youth with his jazz music. And that program, of course, was so influential. I'm sure you know better than I do because you listen to it. But you know, I talked to old Russians who were around at that time, and they talk about how important that program was to them, when they could tune in, when they could avoid the Soviet jamming, of course, and the Soviets pumping literally, you know, equivalent of millions and millions of dollars or pounds or rubles into jamming the signal from you guys.
Yeah, I remember that very well personally. I used to love finding him on my dial, and he was, in a way, he was as important to me as he was to the Soviet audience, because there wasn't a huge amount of jazz around on conventional media at that time. Bit on BBC radio, but that was about it. I should say my father was a professional musician, and he played with a number of pretty hopeless, you know, not jazz bands, not swing bands, I suppose. And oddly enough, one of his things in the mid-30s was to go and do a tour with his band, the wonderfully named Sid Seymour and his Mad Hatters, to Berlin. So right. He'd been there before me. But right. It's often struck me that somebody like Willis Conover, well, there wasn't really anybody like Willis Conover, he was the man, really was a kind of trailblazer for the Beatles in the way that he made the contact musically between East and West.
Absolutely. And I mean, also, of course, for you, jazz, as you know, because that's been a theme throughout your life and work, isn't it? Your most recent film about Ella Fitzgerald, just one of those things. But I mean, just to sort of go back then, so Leslie, you finished your national service, you had this strange time, your kind of life as a spy, rather boring, some of it, but at the same time, right on the border of East and West in the Cold War. And you come back, you start working at Granada TV, and, you know, as you say, it's sort of a dream job, and you're making lots of work, some of it pop work, some of it serious work. But this kind of theme for you, this Cold War, East-West relations theme, it is there throughout, you know, many of the films that you did later. I mean, 1968, you did a film called Invasion about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And also, then then you went on to make the strike, which is about the rise of solidarity in Poland. Of course, that whole thing with solidarity was, the precursor to perestroika, wasn't it? It was the precursor. Some people would say to the end of the, as it's now been called, the First Cold War, as we're now in the second one. But so you did sort of bookmark these significant times in the Cold War. West Berlin, late 50s, 1968 Prague Spring, when the Soviets invade Czechoslovakia, and then solidarity in the 80s when when the empire is about to crumble and fall, and then this is all kind of circling us back to the story of how the Beatles affected the Cold War. As Art Troitsky, our mutual friend, says in your documentary, Art's claim, of course, is that the Beatles had more effect than all the propaganda, and even, in fact, rather grand claim, than the nuclear threat in bringing around the end of the Soviet Empire. But
Art was never would never underplayed anything if it could let it soar. Yes, a dear valued friend, but he was in no doubt whatever about the significance of the Beatles in the collapse of the Berlin Wall and what happened afterwards.
Yeah. So in your case, of course, your story, again, with the Beatles, went right the way back to your early years at Granada. And of course, you get this so I think I understood from what you said earlier is that you were commissioned, to go and film this new, at that time, pretty unknown band who were ripping it up in the Cavern Club in Liverpool. Is that it?
Well, in detail, we were, I can't begin to describe how primitive these things were, but I was a researcher on a strand of tiny little 2, 3, 4-minute films that we were making about contrasts in our region of northwest England. In other words, we had the last toffee maker in Oldham contrasted with somebody who was putting up high energy cable over the Pennines, pretty pedestrian stuff. But one of these things, the producer for this nightly magazine show said, why don't we do something about contrast in music? So we went across the Pennines to Yorkshire and filmed the Brighouse and Raystrick brass band and did the Men of Brass, and then cast around for the thing most unlike this that was looking forward in our region. And one of my young research colleagues at Granada said, I know what, there's these kids in Liverpool, haven't made any records yet, but they're getting a certain amount of attention. Why don't you ring up a man called Brian Epstein and see, if he'd be open to you coming and making a little film with his lads? So I did that, spoke to Brian, and of course he was only to, this is when they're trying out with Decca, still haven't got a contract of much significance, so they're yearningly keen to do this. So Brian invited me and a couple of other trustees from Granada to come down to the Cavern Club. Well, first of all, to the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool and meet him there. And I looked around and I thought, well, where is he? Because the only man in the whole vast lobby at the Adelphi was a very smartly dressed, posh-looking bloke. And I thought, that can't be a rock and roll musician. But of course, it was Brian Epstein. And he said, why don't you come across to the Cavern and meet the lads? So we wandered off through the gloom of Liverpool back streets and arrived at a rather unsalubrious set of stairs leading down into, well, God knows where. And up the stairs, I heard this thrilling noise, which was the Beatles, who were playing to a bunch of kids on a Sunday evening. And I was completely blown away. I mean, I was and am a modern jazz fan, so this wasn't really my music at all.
Mm.
And in fact, I was pretty fed up with rock and roll because my mother ran the music shop associated with my father's musical instrument shop, and she was playing and required to play endless, Bill Haley and Elvis Presley, which I thought was junk because I was by then a fully addicted jazz fan.
Right, so rock and roll sounded quite sort of primitive and a bit basic and naive to you. You'd moved on. But listen, Leslie, can I just ask you? So, is that still a vivid picture in your mind of descending these stairs back in 1962? In August. I mean, can you still see it? Can you still hear it? In fact, can you sort of, as you walk down those stairs and you can hear this kind of racket coming up?
Stephen, I can still smell it. I mean, it was a very, very vivid atmosphere. It was, first of all, it was full of a bunch of kids who had become Beatles fans. The walls were kind of dripping with sweat. It was a most unsalubrious place, but it was, well, you can tell as I speak now, it's a scene and a thing I will not forget ever, partly because of what then went on to happen to the four lads who were doing their thing on the primitive stage at the Cabin Club, and partly because it was in itself completely thrilling and remarkable.
Right. So what you're saying there is you're saying that, okay, everything changes. One's memories change as a result of subsequent events. So obviously the Beatles went on to be the most famous band in the world, probably the most influential band in the world. So of course that would imprint itself on your memory of that event anyway. But you're also saying that, setting aside that, it was just thrilling.
The music was galvanizing, actually. Very simple, very kind of bassy, and then you can imagine the speakers were very primitive. But there was a visceral excitement about what was coming off that stage, and I can remember it to this day. I then went. I went backstage to meet the soon-to-be Fab Four. This was, by the way, quite a crucial time in their evolution, because they had only just a week before sacked Pete Best, their original drummer, and Ringo was a new part of the band. In fact, I think this may have been the very first gig he ever did publicly with them. And I remember standing in the audience while we were waiting to go backstage, and I was surrounded by kids saying, "We want Pete, go home, Ringo," and that was a very strong memory. And I thought, well, who the hell's Pete? I mean, I had no idea. Anyway, the rest of that is history. We went backstage into this scummy little room, which was their changing room. And the first sight was John wringing out his sweat-stained shirt into a bucket. That was the height of his superstar appointments there. And then we went to the pub, and I remember Paul saying, we've written all these songs, but nobody wants to hear them, because they were playing the stuff we know, all the Jerry Lee Lewis and the super rockers. That Liverpool, of course, being a port city, it was getting that music earlier than most other parts of Britain, because sailors brought that music into Liverpool and sold it. I mean, that was a scene which was to be repeated, in my experience, in Eastern Europe, when you could, if you had a Beatles album, you could get an awful lot of money for it.
Right. I mean, and of course, Leningrad itself, another port city, was sort of occupied the same role in a strange way, didn't it, in the Soviet Union, because it was near the West, and it was the place where lots of culture from the West or from other places came into the Soviet Union.
The other great port city, Vladivostok, served the same kind of gateway, a little I mean, it's funny. I thought it would have got its Beatles music later than Moscow, but in fact, it got it earlier because of these merchant seamen bringing the music in. So it's a fascinating stew of influences and avenues and ways in that the music got there.
So you're in Liverpool, or rather, should I say, they're in Liverpool. They're taking all these influences in from American rock and roll and other places. They're writing their songs, and so you're in the pub with them, and they're saying to you, "Look, we're playing this stuff, but we've got our own stuff, and which at that time people were less interested in."
A lot less, yeah. I mean, so that they were doing interspersed in their repertoire in the cavern. It was a weird mixture of sort of show tunes and heavy duty rock and roll. It was a very odd and personal list of material. This was followed by, this first encounter in the pub in Liverpool, which excited me a great deal. I lobbied the local programs producer, the bewildered producer of local programs, about getting the Beatles into the studio in Manchester, into the Granada studio. Meanwhile, we discovered that the little film that we went, get my ducks in a row. We went back after my visit to the Cavern Club about a week later with a film crew and shot a couple of numbers from a lunchtime session. They used to do lunchtimes in the Cavern for the office kids coming out of the offices and being thrilled to be entertained by the Beatles. So we filmed that with some difficulty because the equipment was so very primitive at that time, and it just blew our mics off the stands and so forth. But we got a version of, I think, Kansas City and Some Other Guy. Those were the two things we managed to record. And I remember John saying after we'd shot one take of Some Other Guy, I suppose we'll have to do it again, which we did several times. But I thought it was, wow, amazing.
Well, looking at it now, I mean, if you can watch the footage now, it sounds a bit ropey, but the energy is, the vibe is totally there, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you wouldn't pass by without noticing that something was going on with those lads on that rickety little stage in the Cavern Club. And I remember when we'd shot our lunchtime session, I remember I had to stop my Mini. I had to pull up, and I was so overwhelmed with the vitality of it all. I had to be sick in a ditch before I could carry on driving.
Well, there you go. What better testimony to the power of the Beatles' music than that? So what happened next?
I went around following the Beatles in various scruffy Manchester nightclubs where they played. And then, on a never-to-forgotten occasion, I followed them to New Brighton, in just over the other side of the Mersey from Liverpool, and where they were on a bill they were going up in the world with Little Richard. And by then, months had gone by and we still hadn't screened the film. And Brian was getting very agitated because he was relying on this as part of his, publicity drive. And we hadn't screened the film because it was almost untransmittable. It was technically so limited, and so the soundtrack was sort of all right, but the pictures were, well, you've seen them in where they finally showed up. So I had to fob him off, but I knew that we couldn't get away with this for much longer. So I persuaded the local program's producer to have them in the studio, and they came in. Must have been 6 weeks after we'd done the filming in the Cavern Club, and did. And they did. There were a number of show tunes that they did at that time. This thing called "Till There Was You." That was one of their favourites at that time. So they did kind of slightly acceptable versions of their raunchy reality, and that went down okay as far as I could tell. But while all that was going on, of course, the Beatles were taking off like a Saturn V rocket, and so it was. By then, within about 3 weeks, we wanted them back on the show because they weren't going on any other shows, that just our nightly little magazine show. So they came back and did another slightly raunchier selection of stuff. And by then, I remember when they'd come to do the first gig, nobody was particularly interested. I remember Ringo saying to me, "You got us this gig, didn't you?" And, well, thanks very much. I thought, well, it wasn't. It wasn't very difficult. And then when they came back, I think the third time, because they came back constantly then, because the audience response was as dynamite as you would have thought. By that time, rather than being nobody who paid much attention, there were 10,000 kids trying to knock down the gates at Granada Television. And the speed of that was just unbelievable. I mean, I've never been alongside anything that had so much dynamism.
That dynamism, that kind of rocket-fueled meteoric rise, now that continued obviously throughout the 60s. Were you sort of watching that, witnessing that with sort of open-mouthed wonder because there hadn't been anything like it, certainly not in the UK. I mean, maybe there'd been Elvis and people in the States, but there'd been nothing like that. And then, of course, as they went, the thing which always seems so extraordinary to me is not just how fast they became so famous, but also how fast they developed. I mean, going from doing, slightly cheesy show tune covers, almost 6 years later, they're doing these sort of psychedelic masterpieces. I mean,
absolutely. It's about even quicker than that. I mean, it's to this day, it's a progression, a speed of development quite unlike anyone else I can think of. It's amazing. I was mainly working in Manchester or increasingly on World in Action, the factual series, out of the country. So I lost touch with the evolving, extraordinary development of the Fab Four.
But their music stayed with you, didn't it? And I mean, you were a fan. Okay, so maybe you didn't actually see them when it's in. Of course, by the 1970s, it's kind of all over. But it stays with you sufficiently that if we rapidly fast forward now, all the way through to 2009, you make the film, and also, of course, you've written the book, How the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin, which kind of brings these two things together, doesn't it? So there's, on one hand, there's your life in the Cold War, your interest in Russia and Eastern Bloc and the other programs that you've made, and then also there's this, this deep-rooted connection with the Beatles, and these two things come together in that book and in that documentary. This is what we've been circling around, actually, is that how come, the Beatles had such an impact in the Soviet Union? So what brought you to make that film and to write that book?
When I started to make films in what was then known as the evil empire in the Soviet Union, I early on, I ran into Art Troitsky, and also a very celebrated Soviet journalist called Vladimir Posner, who, funnily enough, I heard on the Today program the other day, because he's still going. He's as much an American as he's a Russian. But Vlad knew there were interesting alternate views of the impact of the Beatles. Vladimir quite liked the Beatles, although he's a jazz fan like me, but he was really aware of the depths of suspicion and loathing that existed within the Kremlin. The old man in there thought the Beatles were dangerous, and as it turned out, they were. They represented everything that the Kremlin was trying to shut down on. They were, as it looked to the Kremlin, ill-behaved louts who carried on in unseemly ways and broke the rules, basically. And I was fascinated by it. And Art, meanwhile, was telling me, if you think they were big in your part of the world, you have no idea what they meant for my generation in Russia.
Right, so for anybody who doesn't know, Artemy Trotsky, who's I've actually done a couple of shows with him here, and he's an old friend of yours, he's a friend of mine. He's, I suppose, if you're from the UK, he's a bit like a kind of Russian John Peel. He's a music journalist, broadcaster. He's been involved with the kind of Russian Soviet underground music scene since the sort of late 60s, early 70s. Now, he, and obviously he'd helped you on various other things, and he himself obviously become a Beatles fan, and he is the person who really talked about their power. As you call it, the old men in the Kremlin, they hated a lot of things about Western culture, didn't it? It was the Cold War, and you could say, fair enough, we didn't like their stuff either. But when it came to music, things that they really didn't like was wild dancing. They didn't like They hated improvisation, right? They stuff which might be seen to arouse unhealthy, unwholesome passions in young Soviets seemed to be a particular target, didn't it? So obviously they hated rock and roll. They were a bit more sympathetic at times to jazz, particularly the more serious chin-stroking jazz. But so the Beatles, in a way, they kind of embodied a lot of that stuff, didn't they? The energy of the music. They were very good-looking. They aroused passions in young Soviets. So that was this kind of background to it. But I want to hear from you, because I think there was another dimension which we've been trying to get to. Because there were other bands like that as well, weren't there? There were the rock and roll bands, there were the Western bands who were pretty boys. But the Beatles had this nuclear atomic effect. Why?
It's such a good question, and I think about it from time to time, and it's very difficult to easily encapsulate it. I think sex appeal had a lot to do with it for the Soviet girls, no question at all. But when I put that question to all the people I got to know and interview and spend time with in the former Soviet Union, nearly all of them used one word, and that was freedom. The music encapsulated a sense of freedom, of we're not going to do what we're told, we're going to make it up as we go along, we don't care what happens, that's what we have to do, that's what we will do. And the regularity with which that was used as some kind of explanation of what was going on there really got to me. I mean, it meant something. It meant the possibility of another life. It meant breaking free of the awful stifled universe that their parents and grandparents had slugged along under. And it, by the time the Beatles hit in Russia, they couldn't really just put you in prison. They sort of tried, but it mostly didn't work out. Mostly it was heavily looked down on and disliked, but they didn't completely shut it down. And indeed, every time they tried to do something really repressive about the Beatles, it increased their must-have ability for the kids. I mean, That was you've probably heard about that from our lovely friend in Coalescing.
Whether they tried to stop them or not, it was completely ineffective. Of course, first of all, on X-ray records, they were Beatles. Then increasingly on magnetic reel-to-reel tapes, and then of course, later other sort of ways. But in your film, it's fascinating to hear all these different people that you speak to, the kind of metaphors that they use. The Beatles were the first hole in the Iron Curtain. They stopped us being Soviet slaves. Kolya Vasin, Russian #1 Beatles fan, says that he became an exile inside his own country after he heard the music of the Beatles. It was like he became an internal emigre. He moved to this state of freedom.
And Kolya wasn't alone. A lot of the people I talked to said just that they allowed us to create kind of an alternative reality inside the repressions of, for Brezhnev's Russia, that was a singularly unattractive place for youngsters. And so it actually, of course, coincided with a period when it had proved impossible to slam down on things in the way that Stalin would have done. He'd have just put them all in a concentration camp or something. But by the mid to late 60s, that was harder and harder to do. I heard from a couple of other people of the reasons why the regime hated the Beatles so much. And Vladimir Posner, my journalist friend, said, with his knowledge of how things looked from inside the Kremlin, what you have to remember is that those old guys couldn't stand being laughed at.
Right.
That was a really big deal. They'd survived off the myth of, indispensability, the fact that they'd always been there, would always been there. And there's these 4 kids laughing at them. Well, not overtly, of course. One of the ways in which the Beatles prospered in the Soviet Union is, of course, they never made an overtly political statement in their lives. The freedom that they radiated was about the content of the music. It wasn't. Right. They weren't singing, Bob Dylan or Pete Seeger ditties. They were doing their own stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, and Artemi, as you said, for Artemi, he says Soviet culture was totally unsexy. And of course, if you look at what was the official offerings of, pop music that kids were supposed to listen to, it was very dull. Comically dull, most of it, yeah. And, but Kolya Vasin, our mutual friend, the late lamented Kolya, and he's in your film, he's in my book. I interviewed him several times, and there he is in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it became, with the John Lennon Temple of Love. Now, he was, he suffered, didn't he, for his love of the Beatles. He was harassed by the Komsomols, youth patrols. He was, I think you talk about it, he was dragged across a railway station by his hair. He was, it didn't stop him though, did it? It didn't stop him because for him, if you liked or loved the Beatles or if you didn't like them, that was the one principle upon which he would judge you. So his teachers or anybody of the older generation who were rude or dismissed the Beatles, that immediately, as far as Kolya was concerned, dismissed them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a marker for whether you were an acceptable human being almost. So, and increasingly, middle-aged people began to enjoy the Beatles, and it was like a contagion that the Kremlin just couldn't contain. It was really an unstoppable, almost a plague that roared through the through the vast Soviet Empire.
Well, of course, the most surprising thing I think in your film is that when you interview Sergei Ivanov, who's became the deputy prime minister of Russia. And, tell us that story, about him being a Beatles fan.
Well, I'd heard that Ivanov was something of a Beatles fan. So I said, could I talk to him? And rather to my surprise, the message came, yes. So we went into the Soviet White House, their government HQ, and then I was greeted by this elegant, well shod, well suited, middle-aged man who promptly, and he's one of the most senior people in the party and in the government, eventually under Putin. He went into this rhapsody about how when he was a kid, the Beatles were just everywhere and everything. So although he was being raised to be a true believing, conforming, politically obedient guy, he couldn't get over his love of the Beatles. And it was really fascinating to hear that someone of his eminence being so obsessed. I remember him saying he used to study the lyrics, as all those kids did, and learned a lot of his English from Beatles lyrics. And he said in A Day in the Life, there was a thing about got out of bed, ran a comb across my head. And he said, I had no idea what a comb was. So I had to look it up in a dictionary. So he got some of his English tuition.
Yeah, that's quite common, wasn't it? And also, it's quite funny because you also say that he must, of course, have listened to them illicitly on, Radio Luxembourg when he was a kid, and then of course he ends up being a kind of pillar of the establishment later on in life. It's quite funny. So as you say, it sort of infects the whole system, and whether art is correct, that it had a greater effect than the threat of nuclear missiles or or the anti-communist propaganda, it certainly did have an absolutely tremendous effect. There became hundreds and hundreds of Beatles tribute bands, and I think the other thing which is really touching about, say, interviewing with Collier, who expresses it, as you said, it was really about freedom, wasn't it? It was that somehow, mysteriously, possibly, a combination of their image, their tunes, and the rather strange, mysterious words, created a door, didn't it? It created a door into a kind of another world which proved the lie to what was being said about the West. Now, I know that we also said a lot of lies about the Soviets, so it's, this was the Cold War, it's propaganda, but do you think it was for a lot of kids that, and even middle-aged people, as you say, that they'd been brought up with certain beliefs about the West, and in actual fact, the Beatles in some way served the lie to that image of the West?
I think that's absolutely true. And as the kids became aware of the Beatles, loved their music, loved the way they looked, they just lost faith in what their elders and betters were telling them. It wasn't the great evil that the party and the school teachers had been bashing them with. It was this lovely music that they liked, and these sexy, funny blokes that they liked very much. So what was the problem? I mean, if that was a problem, they began to question the stance from which this was being criticized. It more or less threw their ability to believe in the system in the trash can. Very
yeah, absolutely. And that kind of image, that sort of dream of the West, the sort of the shattering of that image of the West, and the replacing it with a kind of dream of freedom. As you know, that propelled Collier, has propelled him all his life until 2 years ago, when, very sadly, as I told you, that he committed suicide in St. Petersburg, and under rather mysterious circumstances. And in some ways, it seemed that he'd given up on his dream of there being a permanent temple to John Lennon in St. Petersburg, which was a bit nutty, of course. It was never really going to happen, but it was his dream, wasn't it? And you went to see him in the temple in happier days, and it was an extraordinary other world. It was a temple, it was a shrine, it was a religious place. full of Beatles stuff, ephemera, miscellanea, and Collier sat there like the high priest. And I wonder with the Beatles themselves, or with Paul McCartney and Ringo, if they've got anything to say about this thing, about this tremendous effect that they had in the Soviet Union. Of course, they had a tremendous effect all around the world, so maybe it's just one other country for them, but of course it is an extraordinary, almost spiritual dimension for some kids like Collier, R.I.P., in Soviet times. Well, Leslie, we're sort of drawing to a close, and for you, sort of looking back, I mean, you've made all those films. You made the film about the Beatles, but many other films too. And, you know, we live in a very different world now where those divisions between East and West have sort of changed somewhat. And sort of looking back over that time, over your time, you know, making movies, making documentaries rather about that stuff, how do you feel? I mean, how does it feel for you to have seen those changes from, you know, young Leslie, you know, taken up to Scotland in a strange pig farm to spy on the Soviets to where we are now, you know? What's your sort of take on all that?
I think I'm lucky beyond reason to have been able to do all of that. I really do. I mean, and to have been financed and supported by a range of television companies and even some movie companies from California to Camden Town to do these things. So I just think I'm just really a lucky man, and to have been able to spend so much of my career doing the things I wanted to do, which turned out to be very much along the lines we've been talking about this afternoon, between looking at the relationships between East and West in a rapidly changing situation, looking at the cultural content of that, and just the sheer joy of being able to be an observer, a bystander of all of that stuff. I mean, my Russian was never in any way remarkable, but I had enough to be able to, you know, embed myself to some degree in the scene in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and to know a lot of very crazy people who were part of that revolution, and still remembered it as plainly the most important thing they'd experienced in their entire lives. Even the most improbable people obviously had the feeling that they had been touched by something astonishing. There was no getting away from it, and we all were. I'd asked for what Paul and Ringo thought about it. I don't think they knew about most of that was going on. I mean, Paul played a concert in Red Square in whatever it was, 2003, something like that. And I think he was kind of completely sideswiped. I mean, he finished up wandering through the Kremlin with his wife of the time, and being shown around by Vladimir Putin. I mean, how improbable was that? I wouldn't have thought Putin had any idea who he was or what it was, but he sat at the concert in Red Square, and he felt what that was, which was a roar of joy that came out of that crowd. Concert was right in Red Square, right next to Lenin's tomb, the perfect image of how the Beatles rocked the Kremlin.
How the Beatles rocked the Kremlin. What a great image to end on. Leslie, thank you so much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture to talk about your life and work and the Beatles.
It's a joy to go back and travel that road again with you.
So there we have it, Leslie Woodhead, OBE filmmaker. I'm going to put a link to Leslie's website in the show notes where you can see the incredible range of work that he's done, films and books. all sorts of other stuff. I really hope to get him back actually to talk more about his life as a spy, and possibly also about Dean Reed, the very strange American musician who effectively became a kind of communist pop star at some point in the future. Well, there we go. I hope you enjoyed that, and you can check us out, of course, at bureauoflostculture.com. And of course on Soho Radio and at all the major podcast providers. I'm Stephen Coates, and I'll be back next time with another story from the counterculture. See you then.